No one at the rescue center understood why a seasoned veterinarian would choose to sleep beside a lion that once killed a man. The lion, named Saul, had been so brutally abused he'd lost his roar, living in silence like a breathing ghost. But one night, in the middle of a raging fire, Saul let out a roar that hadn't been heard in years, not to attack, but to protect the woman beside him. And from that moment on, the world began to uncover the truth behind a quiet bond that had remained hidden for 3 years. The first time Dr. Mira Langston laid eyes on the lion, he didn't roar, he didn't pace, he didn't even flinch when she stepped within 20 feet of his enclosure. He just sat there, massive and motionless, like a statue molded from pain and silence. His amber eyes followed her but never blinked. To anyone else, it might have seemed like calm. To Mira, who had spent over a decade reading trauma in animals, it was something far more terrifying. Complete emotional shutdown. The rescue team had named him Saul, short for Solomon, though he never responded to it. He had been liberated from an illegal traveling circus in Nevada after an anonymous tip led authorities to a compound of rusted cages and broken animals. Saul had spent most of his life confined to a 10-by-10 steel box, his claws filed down, his fangs chipped, his voice silenced. Quite literally. The attending vet at the scene had discovered extensive scarring along his larynx. At some point, someone had cut into his throat, damaging the delicate tissue of his vocal cords. The theory was simple. The lion had roared too loudly for the trainer's liking. Mira stood quietly outside the enclosure, watching the way Saul stared past the world, not at it. He was 7 years old, 410 pounds, and completely still. No warning growl, no movement, no interest in the raw beef the staff slid under the gate each morning. In the wild, lions were majestic and unpredictable. Saul was neither. He was empty. She took a breath. The desert wind blew faintly through the sanctuary's chain-link fences, carrying the scent of eucalyptus, dust, and distant burning brush. It was a hot afternoon, the kind that dried sweat before it ever touched skin. The kind Mira hated. It reminded her of Afghanistan. "Has he moved at all?" she asked without turning around. A young handler named Dev shrugged beside her. "Barely. He didn't touch his food yesterday, or today, not even water." "And his vitals?" "Stable, but barely." Mira nodded, lips pressed tight. She'd seen this before, not with lions, but with working dogs returning from combat zones. When an animal's spirit is broken deeply enough, it doesn't lash out, it just gives up. Saul wasn't aggressive, he wasn't defiant, he was grieving. Later that night, Mira reviewed Saul's intake records alone in her trailer. The details were grim. Chronic malnutrition, multiple healed fractures, signs of electric prod wounds on his flanks. All of it painted a picture of long-term systemic abuse. She leaned back in the creaking metal chair, rubbed her temples, and reached absently for her tea. Cold, forgotten. Outside, the sanctuary fell into desert silence. Somewhere across the compound, owls called to each other in low, hollow tones. The lion yard remained dark, lights deliberately kept low to mimic natural dusk. In that artificial twilight, Saul sat in the same position he had all day, watching nothing. Mira opened her laptop and began typing field notes. Day 1. Patient exhibits extreme withdrawal, 0 appetite, 0 vocalization, no response to stimuli or auditory cues. Pupils reactive, breathing shallow but even. Suspect psychological trauma at advanced stage. Suggest limited human interaction and monitoring of hydration levels. She paused. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then she deleted the last line. Suggest supervised human presence, extended exposure, passive proximity, no direct approach, use trauma-informed observation protocols. She saved the file under a new name, Project Saul. The next morning, the team gathered near the main enclosure, murmuring quietly. News of Mira's arrival had spread fast. While she wasn't a celebrity in the traditional sense, within the wildlife rehabilitation world, she had a reputation, especially among trauma recovery programs. Some knew her from her early work with PTSD-affected canine units, others from her controversial papers about co-sleeping therapy with large predators in military care. Few believed her methods would ever translate to apex animals like lions. She didn't mind the skepticism. She only cared about results. Mira stepped up to the observation deck with her notepad tucked under her arm. Soul hadn't moved, not a twitch. His food still untouched, his posture unchanged, his silence oppressive. She spoke softly to Dev. "Clear the area after 9 p.m. No cameras? No spotlights?" He looked at her, confused. "Why?" "I'm going in." "You can't be serious." She turned her gaze to the lion, who blinked once, the first sign of life she'd seen in 36 hours. "I've done this before." "Not with a lion." "I know," she said calmly. "That's why I'm starting slow." That night, Mira entered the enclosure with only a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a book of poetry. No sedation, no barriers, just her and a lion who hadn't roared in years. She set up, her sleeping bag against the farthest wall, carefully angled so her back wasn't exposed. Then she sat, legs crossed, and began to read aloud. Her voice was steady, quiet, the rhythm of someone talking to a frightened child in the dark. "I shut my eyes and all the world drops dead. I lift my lids and all is born again." Sylvia Plath seemed appropriate. Soul didn't react, not with a sound, not with movement. He just stared. Mira read until her throat went dry, then lay down, eyes open, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed danger, but she ignored it. She knew fear wasn't the enemy here. Abandonment was. By dawn, her legs were stiff and her spine ached from the concrete. Soul hadn't moved an inch, but neither had she. It was a draw. In the coming days, Mira repeated the process. She arrived each night at 9, lay quietly near Saul's pen, read to him, hummed lullabies she hadn't sung since Kabul. Sometimes she talked about meaningless things. The price of organic dog food, the rising cost of long-term pet insurance, her favorite flavor of herbal tea. She spoke like he was listening, and perhaps, in some small way, he was. On the 5th night, something changed. It was around midnight. The moon hung low over the horizon, casting long silver bars through the fencing. Mira was halfway through reading Robert Frost when she felt a shift in the air. She looked up. Soul had stood. Her breath caught. The lion took 2 slow steps forward, then 3. Then he lay down again, this time facing her directly, only 12 feet away. It was the closest he'd come. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Then, as if testing the weight of the moment, Soul stretched his body, letting his paws extend forward. He yawned, silently, and rested his head on them, eyes locked with hers. Then he closed them. He slept. Mira lay there, frozen, unsure if she was witnessing progress or preluding danger. But she knew one thing. He had finally let his guard down. It was the beginning of something neither of them could fully understand yet, something that would redefine the very idea of interspecies trust. And still, not a single soul outside those walls knew. No journalists, no donors, not even the sanctuary board. Mira didn't need recognition. What she needed was Soul to live. And to do that, she had to stay, even if it meant risking everything, even if it meant sleeping beside a lion who never roared. Yet. Mira hadn't planned to stay more than a few weeks. Her contract was short, more like a consultation than a full-term engagement. She was meant to assess Soul's condition, offer a trauma treatment plan, and hand him off to the sanctuary's full-time team. But after that 5th night, the first night he slept, all of that changed. Something ancient and invisible had passed between them in the dark. Not affection, not trust, not yet, but recognition, a silent agreement. I see you, I won't hurt you, not if you don't hurt me. Each evening, Mira returned to the enclosure, bringing only her flashlight, her notepad, and a sleeping bag that now permanently smelled like hay, lion musk, and the high desert air. Saul didn't come closer than 10 feet, but he didn't retreat either. The distance felt sacred. Word began to circulate through the sanctuary staff. Whispered comments at coffee stations. Questions disguised as jokes. She really sleeps in there? Has he tried? Anything? Is she insane or just brave? No one dared challenge her outright. Her credentials were too strong. She had been published in veterinary journals, had trained military canine units overseas, and had once been featured in a special on National Geographic. Still, none of that mattered to Mira. What mattered was that Sewell no longer lay frozen in that same statue pose. He slept. He blinked. He even stretched. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was movement, and that was enough. On the 7th night, Mira jolted awake just after midnight. A sound, soft, rhythmic, deep, not a growl, not a snarl, a breath. Sewell was beside her, not close enough to touch, but closer than ever before. His massive body was curled into the straw bedding, his flank rising and falling steadily, eyes closed. Mira's pulse roared in her ears. She dared not move. Every instinct from her past deployments shouted at her to crawl away, to protect her back. But her training whispered something else. Don't break the pattern. Stay present. So she lay there, spine stiff, legs numb, and listened to the sleeping lion breathe. It wasn't the lion that kept her awake the rest of the night. It was the memories. Years ago, under a different sky, Mira had slept on the floor of a makeshift trauma unit in Kandahar, side by side with a German shepherd named Rook. He had been part of a special bomb detection unit. His handler, a young corporal named Reese, had been killed in a roadside ambush. Rook had survived, but barely. He refused to eat, refused to respond to anyone. He had curled himself into the corner of the medic tent, eyes wide, body shaking, emitting a high-pitched whimper that never stopped. Mira, then only a veterinary intern assigned to the military contractors unit, had tried everything: sedatives, calming sprays, even scent retraining protocols. Nothing worked. Until one night, against orders, she pulled her sleeping bag next to him, whispered to him the way she'd once talked to her childhood dog, and waited. By morning, Rook had stopped shaking. By day 3, he ate. By the end of the month, they were inseparable. She hadn't thought about Rook in years. Not until Saul. Not until that same silence returned, wrapped in a much larger, much more dangerous body. Back at her trailer, Mira poured black coffee into a metal thermos and stared out the window at the sunrise. The air still smelled like ash from last week's brush fires. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the cup to her lips, not from fear, from memory. Later that morning, she filed a formal request to extend her contract. She didn't tell the board why. Luke was the first to ask. He always was. "You staying longer?" he asked, balancing a tray of medication vials in one hand while peeking into the lion feed room. Mira nodded. "Saul needs consistency." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "So do people." She didn't answer. Luke was one of the few staff members who never questioned her methods. He was quiet, capable, and rarely wasted time on small talk. A former animal control officer turned wildlife tech, he'd seen enough cruelty to know when not to interfere with healing. One evening, after a particularly tense board meeting about resource allocation and liability insurance, Luke met her by the enclosure. "They're nervous," he said, leaning against the gate. "They should be," Mira replied. "We've got a 400-pound lion and no plan B." I'm guessing you've got a plan A. Plan A is this, she said, gesturing to the enclosure where Sol lay sprawled in the straw, tongue slightly poking from his mouth. Time, consistency, and human presence. Sounds expensive, Luke said. Not as expensive as euthanizing him would be, or letting him waste away in that cage. Luke hesitated. Then he pulled something from his pocket. A small camera, the kind hikers used for documenting wildlife at night. I've been filming, he said quietly. Just small clips, for research. You're doing something different here, and I think someday people might want to know why it worked. Mira looked at the camera, then at Luke. For a brief second, something passed between them. Not affection, but alignment. Keep filming, she said. And he did. Each night Mira returned to Sol's side. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes they sat in silence so thick she could hear the blood in her ears. Other times she read aloud from old novels, bits of history books, or even articles on high-risk pet insurance policies, whatever kept her voice steady and her nerves distracted. Sol moved closer, inches at a time. By the end of week 3, he lay only 5 feet from her. By the end of month 1, his massive paw sometimes rested near her sleeping bag, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from it. But he still hadn't roared. Not once. Mira made careful notes about that. The scarring on his throat wasn't fresh. It had been deliberate, perhaps surgical, likely done years ago in an attempt to control him. Every large cat act needed showmanship, just not noise. Loud lions intimidated audiences. A silent lion was easier to sell. The thought made her stomach twist. She researched regenerative vocal therapies used in both animals and humans. None had reliable outcomes. Some required surgical intervention that was too invasive. Others relied on expensive laser treatments. Mira wasn't looking to heal his voice, just to understand what had been taken from him. One night, while flipping through data, she paused on an article about assisted communication in trauma-recovered animals. It was from a conference she'd missed years ago, buried under casework. But a phrase caught her eye. Sometimes the absence of sound is not silence. It is survival. She read it 3 times, then looked up, past her, laptop into the enclosure where Sol lay, watching her through the bars. And for the first time she wondered, did he miss the sound of his own voice? Did he even remember it? Sleep came late that night, and when it did, it was restless. She dreamed of a lion pacing a steel cage, its mouth open in a roar no one could hear. She woke up crying. Sol didn't move, but his eyes were open, staring, watching, as if he understood, as if he remembered, too. It wasn't the fear that surprised her. It was how familiar it felt. The cold concrete beneath her sleeping bag, the rhythmic sound of breathing, not her own, the deep hum of silence between 2 creatures who had learned not to trust. Mira had been here before, not in this lion's cage, but in this space of uncertainty, where instincts and memory collided like storm fronts. This time, though, she wasn't the one grieving. She arrived just after sundown, her steps quieter now, more instinctual. The enclosure was dimly lit, mimicking the natural dusk of the savannah. Sol was already awake, lying near the eastern wall, head up, eyes locked on her. He didn't rise, didn't flinch, didn't turn away. Mira didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary. She unrolled her sleeping bag slowly, performing the ritual as she always did. Same direction, same pace, same distance. Her consistency was part of the therapy. Animals like Sol relied on patterns, on things that didn't change when everything else had. She lay down, heart steady but alert. Sol didn't move. The hours passed slowly. Somewhere beyond the enclosure, the sanctuary's night crew moved equipment. She could hear the hum of electric fencing being checked, the dull thud of feed bins closing. But inside the enclosure, it was just her and him. Stillness. A kind of mutual waiting. At 12:43 a.m., Sewell stood. Mira didn't reach for her flashlight. She heard the soft scrape of claws against concrete, the faint rustle of hay as he padded forward. Slowly, deliberately. He crossed the space between them, not like a predator, but like something testing the weight of its own courage. When he stopped, he was close enough for her to feel his breath, warm, steady, tinged with the musk of meat and dust and earth. She held her own breath, unsure what would come next. Then gently, his nose touched her shoulder. Not forceful, not threatening, just contact. He exhaled, a long, low gust that warmed the fabric of her shirt, and lowered himself onto the straw beside her. Not too close, not touching, but present. Mira closed her eyes. It was the first time in weeks she'd felt safe enough to sleep. In the morning, the sunrise bled slowly across the desert sky. Mira stirred before her alarm and turned her head. Sewell was still there, his back to her, his great body rising and falling in sleep. She sat up slowly, muscles stiff, careful not to disturb him. From the observation deck above, Luke stood with his camera lowered, not filming. "I didn't think you'd make it through the night," he said when she joined him. "I wasn't sure I would either," she replied. He nodded, then handed her a small thermal mug. "Coffee? Black? No sugar. Thought you might need it." She took it gratefully. "You always this thoughtful?" "No," he said, "just impressed." They stood in silence, watching Saul stir. He rose slowly, stretched, then walked to his water basin, and drank for the first time in 2 days. "He's responding," Luke said quietly. Mira nodded. "He's waking up." Later that day, she updated her notes. Day 27. First contact initiated by subject. Close physical proximity tolerated. No signs of aggression or distress. Subject remains non-vocal. Appetite returning. Recommend continuation of night presence protocol. She closed the laptop and stared at the wall of her trailer. There were still no answers, only instincts. By week 6, Sewell had a routine. He waited by the gate when she arrived, sometimes pacing, sometimes still, but always aware. As soon as she laid down, he'd approach slowly and settle within arm's reach. He never touched her again, not directly, but his presence wrapped around her like a weighted blanket. He slept deeper now, fewer flinches, no sudden starts. She noted each change meticulously. Trust, Mira understood, wasn't built with grand gestures. It was built with repetition. Stillness, safety. That was true for lions, and it was true for her. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in from the east, rare and fierce. Lightning split the sky as winds whipped through the sanctuary's low structures. Most of the animals retreated to their dens, pacing or hiding. Saul didn't. He stayed out, head tilted toward the sky, eyes following the streaks of light. Mira stayed with him, soaked and shivering in her sleeping bag, watching him watch the storm. "Are you remembering something?" she asked aloud. He didn't respond, but he didn't run either. The next morning, Dev told her the board had scheduled a check-in call with donors, some high-profile names interested in how the sanctuary handled difficult rescues. There was talk of showcasing Saul's progress, videos, photos, maybe a virtual tour. "No," Mira said. "He's not ready." "They're not asking," Dev said. "They're telling." Mira spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the ache in her spine and the tightness in her jaw. She knew what this meant. Publicity brought funding. Funding brought longevity. The sanctuary needed both. But Saul wasn't a show animal. He was barely learning how to exist. She typed up a compromise proposal. No live feeds, no in-person visits. A short edited segment from Luke's footage, no more than 2 minutes, carefully reviewed. The board agreed. Barely. That night, Mira didn't read. She didn't talk. She lay beside Saul in silence, feeling the pressure mounting outside their enclosure, and wondered how long she could keep him hidden from the world. At 3:17 a.m., she felt something. Pressure, not danger, not weight. Warmth. Saul had extended a paw, massive, scarred, and silent, across the small space between them, resting it gently against the edge of her sleeping bag. She didn't move. She barely breathed. She just let him touch her, lightly, like a child reaching out in the dark to make sure someone was still. There. It was not dominance. It was not ownership. It was trust. And in that moment, Mira knew, whatever had been broken in him wasn't beyond repair. Not anymore. By the 3rd month, the lion enclosure had become something else entirely. Not a cage, not even a recovery space. It was a kind of sanctuary inside the sanctuary, a place no one entered without Mira's permission and no one truly understood. The staff learned to walk softer when passing by, to speak in low tones, to respect the unseen rhythm between the woman and the lion. Sol waited for her now. At dusk, he'd rise from his bed of straw and walk the perimeter near the gate, ears pricked forward. If Mira was late, even by minutes, his pacing would become tighter, more agitated. Luke noticed first. "He tracks your car," he told her one evening. "I saw him lift his head the second you turned off Highway 6. It's like he knows." Mira didn't respond. She just tightened the strap of her gear bag and made her way inside. Each night she followed the same steps, not because she believed in superstition, but because Sol did. The same flashlight, the same sleeping bag, the same side of the enclosure, and now, increasingly, the same distance. Sol no longer slept beside her. He slept with her. Pressed lightly against her back, his flank rising and falling like a slow tide. Some nights, his paw would rest across her leg. On colder nights, he'd curl tighter around her, like a living wall of warmth. She never touched him first. Always she waited. The first time she whispered his name and he turned his head, she cried. Not loudly. Just a slow leak of breath and salt that slid across her face and soaked into the pillow beneath her. There was no audience, no celebration, just a word remembered and a soundless response. In her notes, Mira began referring to Sol's recovery as behavioral reawakening. She documented his expressions, his tail movement, the subtle ways he responded to weather shifts or voices from afar. She noted how he reacted when other lions nearby called out. A twitch of the ear, a low flick of his tail. Never a sound in return. He was healing, yes, but he was also changed forever. Some scars never let go of the voice they took. The footage Luke captured was beginning to pile up. Nearly 40 hours of night vision clips, daytime feedings, slow panning shots of Sol's quiet presence. He edited them late into the night, adding soft ambient sound and labeling folders by date. He didn't show anyone, not even Mira. Not yet. "I'm not done," he said when she asked. He's not done. Neither was she. During the day, Mira worked on building Sol's confidence beyond their private space. She introduced him to new objects, balls, ropes, even a heavy tire swing. At first, he ignored them all. But eventually, curiosity won out. He nudged the rubber with his paw, batted the rope once, investigated the ball for nearly 20 minutes before lying on top of it as if claiming territory. It wasn't play yet, but it was exploration. And exploration was the first step to joy. A donor from a major animal wellness brand visited the facility that week. She arrived in a luxury SUV, accompanied by 2 PR reps and a professional photographer. Mira was asked to give a short briefing on Sol's progress. She did so, carefully avoiding personal details, highlighting behavioral milestones and rehabilitation strategies. The donor seemed impressed. "We'd love to build a campaign around him," she said. "Maybe even pair it with some of our pet insurance content. You know, emotional stories sell." Mira smiled politely. "He's not ready for the spotlight?" "Is he ever dangerous?" "No," Mira said softly. "He's broken." The rep shifted uncomfortably. They moved on to other animals. That night, Mira found herself restless inside the enclosure. Sol, sensing her unease, rested his head on her chest, his eyes blinking slowly up at her. She stroked the air above his mane, never touching, just hovering, and whispered things she hadn't said aloud in years. "I don't know how much longer I can protect this," she admitted. "They'll want more. Attention, exposure. They don't understand you're not a story. You're a being." He didn't react, but he stayed close. In her laptop, Mira drafted a memo to the board proposing a long-term rehabilitation protocol modeled after Sol's recovery. She called it Proximity Therapy in Apex Species. She outlined daily contact structures, sleep-based bonding, and passive stimulus tracking. She knew it wouldn't be adopted widely. It required time, space, patience, and none of those came cheap. Still, she wrote it, because someday someone else might try, and maybe it would work. Luke started sleeping in the trailer next to hers more often. Not inside the enclosure, never that, but nearby, just in case. He never said it outright, but Mira knew what he was doing, watching her, making sure she wasn't giving too much of herself away. One morning she coughed hard enough to see red, in the sink. She rinsed it away before anyone noticed. At her next check-in with the sanctuary medic, she complained of fatigue, blamed it on concrete floors and long nights. Stress? The usual? He offered her vitamin supplements and told her to rest. She nodded. But rest wasn't what she needed. She needed time. Sol's transformation was slow, like watching winter thaw into spring. The change didn't come in leaps, but in shifts. He responded to his name more often. He waited less at the gate and more in the open. He slept longer, deeper, without twitches or flinches. The dark circles beneath his eyes faded. He even began to purr, low, soft, intermittent, but real. The first time Mira heard it, she stopped writing mid-sentence, looked up, watched him breathe, and smiled. They'd found their rhythm, and no one outside that corner of the world had any idea it was happening. No interviews, no articles, no fanfare. Just a lion and a woman sharing sleep beneath a fractured sky, and neither one feeling afraid anymore. The wind came first, sharp, sudden, hot. Then came the smoke. It slid under the gates and through the cracks like a ghost, curling low along the straw and dirt, nearly invisible until the scent reached Mira's nose. She sat up fast, ears straining. Somewhere beyond the enclosure, someone was shouting, not the usual calls between handlers. This was different, frenzied, panicked. Then came the unmistakable crack of something wooden collapsing. She turned toward the gate and saw it, flames licking the edge of the eastern barn. Orange, rising fast, too fast for anything natural. Mira was on her feet before she had time to think. Her boots hit the ground just as the emergency sirens began to whine. Sol stood too, head high, tail flicking in tight, anxious jerks. His eyes locked on hers. "It's okay," she said out loud, though she wasn't sure it was. She grabbed the gate release lever, but it jammed. The backup control system had failed. Smoke was rising higher now, the wind pushing it west, straight toward them. Through the haze, she saw Dev and Luke running from the far end of the sanctuary with fire extinguishers and hoses. Someone had lit this fire. Mira didn't wait for help. She ran to the far end of the enclosure and began tugging at the emergency release, a steel manual lock nearly rusted shut. Sol didn't pace. He stayed by her, silent and still, ears flicking, body tense. The lock gave. The door creaked open just enough for her to slide through. But before she could get Saul into the secondary containment area, another explosion rocked the barn behind them, sending debris flying into the sky. A piece of burning wood landed not 10 feet from where she stood. Saul moved, not away from the fire, toward her. It happened fast. One moment she was turning, the next she was on the ground, the breath knocked from her chest. Saul's body covered hers, shielding her from the falling ash and fragments. He wasn't growling, he wasn't snarling. But when he lifted his head toward the flames, he roared. Not a full, clean roar, not the kind she had once heard echo through savannas. This was broken, hoarse, strained, but real. It ripped from his throat like something ancient finally released. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The sound echoed off the concrete walls. It shook her ribs. It drew the attention of every staff member within range. Luke was the first to arrive. He saw them through the smoke, Mira on the ground, Saul standing over her, his mouth open, chest heaving, eyes blazing. "Mira!" she waved him off weakly. "I'm fine. Get Saul to containment." Luke hesitated for just a second, then turned to open the path. Mira coaxed Saul with her voice, hoarse and shaking. He followed. They emerged from the smoke together, her hand resting just above his shoulder, not touching, guiding. The cameras mounted on the perimeter caught it all. Her, walking through fire with a lion at her side, the ash spiraling around them like snow. By morning the fire was out. Half the barn was gone. Several animals were relocated, some frightened but uninjured. The investigation began immediately. Arson, likely someone angry about the recent shutdown of an exotic pet ring the sanctuary had exposed. But none of that mattered to Mira, because Saul had roared, not once, twice. The second came just after sunrise, when she brought him his water and a fresh blanket. He saw her, rose to meet her, and opened his mouth. The sound that followed wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it was enough to bring Mira to her knees. In the days that followed, Saul became more alert. His appetite doubled. He began vocalizing in short bursts, rumbles, huffs, even a guttural bark that startled the younger interns. It wasn't just healing, it was evolution. The board requested a meeting. Mira walked in with dirt still under her nails and a healing cut across her cheek. "Whatever you're doing," one of them said, "it's working." They wanted to talk next steps, marketing, branding, sponsorships, viral potential. She sat quietly through it all until someone used the word miracle. "He's not a miracle," she said. "He's a survivor." They asked her to consider giving interviews, a short docu-series, perhaps partnering with a popular pet insurance brand to spotlight exotic animal recovery efforts. Mira said she'd think about it. She didn't. What she did think about was how Saul had shielded her, how he'd made a choice, in the smoke and noise, to protect the one being he trusted. Not because he was trained, not because he was told, because he wanted to. At night, their routine resumed. The enclosure, though smoke-scarred and partially rebuilt, still held their rhythm. Saul pressed close again, more than ever now. His purring grew louder. Sometimes it shook the straw beneath them. Mira didn't tell anyone about the headaches, or the sharp flashes of light behind, her eyes when she stood up too quickly, or the numbness creeping into her fingers. It wasn't the time. Instead, she focused on Saul's progress. She began introducing new stimuli, recorded lion calls, scents from other big cats, even a safe mirror enclosure to test his self-recognition. He responded with curiosity, not fear. He was ready to expand. But Mira wasn't. Luke noticed. "You're pale," he said one evening. Not the usual, "I work with lions" pale. Different. "I'm tired." Then sleep. "I do," she lied. Luke didn't push, but the next morning there was a thermos of turmeric tea on her trailer steps. Anti-inflammatory, brain support, good for focus. She didn't ask how he knew. Sewell watched her more now, like he sensed something had shifted. He pressed closer during sleep. Sometimes his nose nudged her shoulder in the middle of the night, as if checking she was still there. Still breathing? She always was. Until one night, she wasn't, at least not fully. She woke on her back, eyes blurry, the sky above swimming. Sewell's face hovered just above hers, his breath warm, his paw resting against her chest. She had no memory of lying down. Her vision swam. Her chest ached, and then it passed. But it was enough. She made an appointment the next day, quietly, without telling anyone. The clinic in town took her blood, ran tests, asked questions. A week later, she received the call. It was a tumor, not benign, not small. She hung up the phone and sat for a long time on the concrete steps outside the medical trailer. Luke found her there an hour later, staring at the dust swirling in the wind. He didn't ask. She didn't speak. But that night, when she entered the enclosure, she looked at Sewell differently. Not with fear, not even with grief, with purpose. Because now she knew. Time wasn't on her side, but it still belonged to her, and she would give every hour of it to him. The first time someone used those words, "the woman who sleeps with a lion," Mira barely flinched. It came from a junior staff member, whispered behind a closed door, meant more as awe than ridicule. But once spoken, it spread like wildfire. Volunteers repeated it, journalists hinted at it. A podcaster reached out for an exclusive, calling her the Lion Whisperer in the email subject line. She deleted it without opening. Luke warned her gently. It's not just sanctuary gossip anymore. I know. They're asking questions. Let them. He hesitated. Do you want this to get out? She didn't answer right away. She sat at the edge of her trailer steps, watching the sun dip behind the distant hills, turning the sky the color of blood oranges. No one would understand it the way it really is, she finally said. They'd turn it into a symbol, or worse, a story. Maybe it is a story. It's not finished yet. Sewell had been thriving. The vocalizations, while still strained, came more regularly now. Short rumbles, low purrs, even the occasional half-roar during feedings. He responded to cues. He walked into new areas of the enclosure without hesitation. He tolerated new handlers, briefly, carefully, but without visible stress. He still waited for Mira every night. She still came, but her body was changing. Some mornings she struggled to stand after sleeping on the concrete. Her left hand lost feeling more often. Once, during a mid-morning briefing with the veterinary staff, she forgot the name of the new medication they'd just ordered, one she herself had approved. The gap in memory wasn't long, but it was sharp, like stepping on glass barefoot. The tumor was growing. Quietly, unforgiving. She hadn't told anyone but Luke, and even he didn't know the full prognosis. 3 to 6 months, the neurologist had said. Maybe more if she responded to treatment. But the treatment would mean stepping away, and stepping away meant abandoning Sewell at the exact moment when he was starting to live again. That night, Mira moved her sleeping bag 6 inches farther from him. He noticed. He didn't sleep. Neither did she. She knew what had to come next. A transition, a slow, steady introduction of other caregivers, new voices, new rhythms. She couldn't disappear on him. It would unravel everything. Trauma didn't forget abandonment. It archived it. Over the following weeks, she started inviting Dev and another handler named Sal into their space, first during daylight, then around dusk. At first, Sewell was rigid, cautious. He'd press closer to Mira, eyes following every movement. But Mira stayed calm, kept her voice steady, and let time do the work. Slowly, Sewell adjusted. Sal brought him meals. Dev brushed the straw from his mane one afternoon without incident. Small things. But monumental. Mira recorded every session. Luke helped catalog the footage. They created training guides, behavior charts, even audio tracks of Mira's voice reading bedtime stories and calming monologues. She recorded lullabies, too. Songs her mother used to hum, things that carried the texture of safety. "I want him to know I'm still here," she told Luke one night as they stood outside the enclosure gate. "You won't always be." "I know," she said, "but maybe part of me can be." The sanctuary board noticed Sewell's progress. There was talk of reintroducing him to other lions in the reserve semi-wild area. A long process, gradual, but possible. One of the lead biologists had seen the footage of Sewell pressing his head against Mira's chest in sleep and said, "He may never bond with another lion, but he's ready to try." Still, Mira hesitated. He was ready. She wasn't. One night, she had another episode. A seizure. Not violent, but enough to leave her disoriented on the floor of her trailer, clutching the bed frame with her right hand, while her left twitched uselessly. Sewell sensed something had shifted. That night, he followed her every step in the enclosure. He rested his head on her lap without prompting. When she stirred in her sleep, he pressed his nose to her temple gently, again and again, until her breathing evened out. Luke found her the next morning, seated against the back wall, eyes open but vacant. It took nearly 30 seconds for her to recognize him. "You need to stop," he said. "I can't." "You're not helping him if you collapse in front of him." "I'm not leaving him to figure this out alone." "Then we figure it out together." She met with the sanctuary's director the next day. Told the truth, or most of it, that she had a serious health condition, that her time at the facility would be limited, that she wanted to create a final protocol for Saul's integration and eventual independence. She offered to hand over all her documentation, her footage, her notes, everything. The director paused, then said softly, "You love him." "I do," Mira said, "but that's not what qualifies me to finish this. What qualifies me is that he loves me back." That night, she recorded her final nighttime session on a separate audio track. Not a story, not a lullaby, just a letter. "Saul, you don't know what death is, and I hope you never have to, but you do know what absence feels like. So if one day I don't come back, I need you to remember something. I didn't leave because of you. I left because my body couldn't stay. You gave me peace. You gave me purpose. You gave me 3 more years than anyone thought I had. Sleep now, brave boy. You're safe." She fell asleep that night with Saul's head resting over her shoulder, his breath warm against her throat. For the first time in weeks, she didn't wake up in pain. Just quiet. Just peace. Outside the enclosure, Luke checked the camera feed, saved the audio file, and labeled it. Final Night 1, Master Copy. Then he closed his laptop, wiped his eyes, and stood alone beneath the floodlights, humming gently over their quiet corner of the world. February arrived with a coldness that didn't belong to the desert. The wind was sharp, the mornings slower. Mira moved through them like someone walking underwater, measured, tired, deliberate. Her body betrayed her more often now. Words came slower, her vision fuzzier. Sometimes she would reach for an object and forget what it was. Once she found herself standing in Saul's enclosure, staring at the feeding bucket with no idea why she was holding it. Saul had noticed. He hovered now, more than ever, never quite letting her drift too far from his sight. When she walked the perimeter, he walked beside her. When she sat, he pressed his body close. When she coughed, his ears pinned back. She'd once believed she was saving him. Now she wasn't so sure. The sanctuary team had been briefed. Luke had taken over most of her physical duties, stepping into the enclosure under Sewell's watchful eye. There had been a few tense days of adjustment, but Mira's presence always calmed. The lion. A word from her, even whispered, and Sul would soften, settle. She was fading, yes, but she still held gravity. The preparations for Sul's transfer had begun. The northern facility, a sprawling protected reserve in the highlands, had agreed to take him. It was home to a semi-wild lion pride and was one of the few places on Earth experimenting with guided reintegration. No fences between lions, just open terrain, trained staff, and the hope that time and nature would rebuild what captivity had taken. Mira had chosen it herself. It was the only place that wouldn't undo the progress they had made. Still, convincing Sul to leave was not something that could be forced. Mira had to guide him toward it, not push. So she began changing the routine, first in subtle ways, then more directly. She arrived at the enclosure 10 minutes later each evening, sat farther from him during sleep, allowed longer gaps between her voice and his reactions. At first, Sul resisted. He pawed at the sleeping bag when she moved it. He circled restlessly when she paused reading. One night, he let out a low, sharp vocalization, not quite a roar, but close, a sound Mira had never heard from him. A protest. She didn't speak. She just watched him. Then, slowly, placed her hand on the ground between them. He stared at it, then lowered his head and rested it beside hers. That was the night she knew he was ready to begin letting go. Luke helped build a transition plan. It included scent mapping, audio familiarization, gradual distance desensitization. They introduced Saul to voices of the new caregivers via recorded messages. They played sounds of the distant wilderness, the wind through trees, the low call of other lions far away. They brought in bedding from the northern facility to acclimate him to the scent. He adapted, not easily, but steadily. The biggest change came when Mira didn't stay the night. It was a test. She told Sul as much. "I'll be gone. Tonight," she whispered against his mane. "But I'll come back in the morning. You'll be okay." He followed her to the gate. Didn't protest, just watched. That night, for the first time in nearly 3 years, Mira slept in her own bed. And Sul slept too. Luke watched the camera feed until 3 a.m., waiting for restlessness, waiting for pacing. But Sul curled up near the wall where Mira usually lay and didn't move until dawn. The next day, Mira entered the enclosure as always. Sul met her at the center. He pressed his head to her chest and let out a long, slow breath. Not panic, not distress, acceptance. A week later, the transport arrived. A custom-designed wildlife trailer, air-conditioned, padded, quiet. Mira supervised every step. She walked through the crate with Sul before loading, let him sniff the restraints, rubbed her hand over every metal surface he'd touch. Luke handled the paperwork. The handlers from the Northern Reserve watched in respectful silence. No one spoke as Mira gave the signal. Sul walked into the crate without hesitation. The team moved efficiently. The doors closed. The truck rolled forward. Mira climbed into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. She wasn't supposed to go. She insisted anyway. The journey took 6 hours. Mira stayed silent most of the ride, her hand resting lightly on the metal wall of the crate, as if willing her presence through it. When they arrived, the air was cooler. The trees swayed in steady rhythm, and the sky was the color of deep steel. The receiving enclosure was large, fenced but open, with a wide view of the main reserve and the lion pride beyond. Sul stepped out slowly, nose lifted, ears flicking. He didn't retreat. He didn't growl. He walked to the edge of the enclosure and watched the horizon. Mira spent the next 3 days on site. She slept in a small trailer nearby, observed the interactions, monitored his feeding, helped introduce him to the sights and sounds of his new home. The other lions came near, curious. The matriarch, a tall female named Amara, approached the fence and held her gaze with Sul's for a long time. There was no aggression, only recognition. On the morning of the fourth day, Mira stood beside the fence one last time. Sol approached. She didn't speak. He didn't vocalize. He leaned forward and rested his forehead lightly against the mesh. She mirrored him. Then she turned, walked away without looking back, and let the tears come only once she passed beyond the trees. By the time she reached the car, Luke was waiting. He didn't ask how it went. He just said, "You did it." "No," Mira said, voice breaking. "We did." That night, Sol didn't wait by the gate. He lay under the stars, watching the sky, surrounded by the sounds of lions calling in the distance. And though he didn't roar, he didn't need to. 3 weeks after Saul's relocation, the sanctuary received the email. It was short, quiet, from Luke. Mira passed early this morning, peacefully, no pain. She was listening to the last audio she recorded for him. I was with her. She wasn't alone. They all knew the day would come. Still, no one was ready. The sanctuary lowered the flag at half-mast. Staff walked slower. Volunteers who had only met Mira once or twice stood in silence beside the enclosure she used to sleep in. The straw still bore the shape of her sleeping bag. The gate she passed through each night hadn't been touched. It stayed open, as if waiting. Luke didn't speak for 2 days. He edited quietly, alone in the media trailer, surrounded by hard drives and cables. Over 70 hours of footage, hundreds of audio files, scans of Mira's notebooks, her charts, her late-night voice memos, every moment cataloged in silence. And then he hit export. The video was titled, "She Slept with a Rescued Lion for 3 years, and no one knew why until now." It was uploaded with no press release, no trailer, no influencer outreach, just a caption, "In memory of Dr. Mira Langston." The internet did the rest. Within 24 hours, the video crossed 1 million views. By the end of the week, it had 10. Local news picked it up first, then national outlets, then international. People couldn't believe it. A woman, a lion, 3 years of silence, sleep, healing. No fame, no spotlight, just presence. Comment sections filled with disbelief, wonder, gratitude. She gave him back his voice. She made him human again? No, she let him be a lion. Across the globe, animal shelters reported spikes in inquiries. People donated in Mira's name. Some wrote messages saying they'd changed their wills. Others simply said, "I'll never see animals the same way again." Luke declined every interview. He uploaded the full series, unedited, under the title The Saul Tapes. No monetization, no ads, just truth. Sol, now living in the Northern Reserve, was adjusting, slowly. Amara, the matriarch, had allowed him near her cubs once. He'd kept his distance, but hadn't turned away. The younger males circled him, testing, watching. He didn't engage much, but he stayed. Each evening, just before sundown, he walked to the western ridge of the enclosure and laid down facing the trees. It became a pattern. Staff began noticing. He never roared, not anymore. But some nights he'd make a low, steady sound, almost like humming, a vibration more than a voice. They called it his song. One of the new handlers, a young woman named Eliza, brought a faded sleeping bag into the enclosure on Mira's birthday. She placed it beneath the acacia tree where Saul liked to sleep. He sniffed it once, then lay beside it, didn't move for hours. The sanctuary eventually created a memorial at the base of that tree, a small stone engraved simply, "She slept with lions so they could dream again." Luke visited that spring. The wind was cool, the hills quiet. He sat alone beside the tree, fingers tracing the carved words. Sol was visible in the distance, stretched beneath the brush, surrounded by birdsong and shadow. For a long time, Luke didn't move. Then, carefully, he pulled something from his bag. Mira's last journal. He left it beneath the stone. Later that evening, he stood at the edge of the enclosure, watching Sol pace the perimeter like he used to. It was a familiar rhythm, one that once meant waiting. Now it meant remembering. Luke spoke softly into the dusk. "She stayed, you know, even when it hurt, especially then." Sol didn't react, but he stopped pacing, turned, faced him, then lowered his head and rested it on the ground. Luke stayed until nightfall, then left quietly. The staff said Sol didn't move again until morning. Years passed. Sol aged. The younger lions became leaders of their own spaces, but Sol never joined a pride fully. He remained on the edge, not isolated, just different. He didn't need a family. He'd had one. And though he never roared again, that never mattered. He had once, when it counted, when she needed him most. And now, when the wind moved through the trees and the dusk light fell across the sanctuary, visitors often paused near the memorial tree. They'd ask the staff, "Is that really the lion?" The staff would nod. "Why doesn't he roar?" The answer never changed. Because she gave him peace. And sometimes that's louder than sound.